Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. March 19th, 2004, a Friday evening in rural Vermont. The kind of night where the air still carries the bite of winter, where the roads are quiet, and where small town life moves at its own gentle pace. In Montgomery, Vermont, a tiny community nestled in the northern reaches of the state, most people knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors waved from their porches, where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. The Black Lantern Inn sat along Route 118, a modest establishment that served as both a restaurant and a gathering place for locals. It wasn't fancy, it didn't need to be. The food was good, the atmosphere warm, and for the small staff who worked there, it felt like family. 17-year-old Brianna Maitland had just finished her shift. It was around 11:20 p.m. when she clocked out, said her goodbyes to her co-workers, and walked out into the cold Vermont night. She climbed into her 1985 Oldsmobile sedan, a green car that had seen better days but ran well enough. Her plan was simple: drive the short distance home, maybe unwind for a bit, and rest up for the weekend. But Brianna Maitland never made it home. By the next morning, her car would be found in one of the most bizarre and haunting scenes in Vermont's history. Abandoned, crashed into the side of an old farmhouse. The driver's door wide open, her belongings scattered inside, and Brianna, gone. What happened to Brianna Maitland that night remains one of Vermont's enduring mysteries. Despite thousands of tips, multiple investigations, and years of searching, no one has ever been able to answer the simplest, most agonizing question: where is Brianna? Brianna Alexandra Maitland was born on October 8, 1986, in Burlington, Vermont. She grew up in a loving family, the daughter of Bruce and Kelly Maitland, who adored her from the moment she entered the world. Brianna had an older brother, and together they shared a childhood filled with the simple joys of rural Vermont life, exploring the woods, playing in the snow, spending time with family. From an early age, Brianna was known for her independent spirit. She wasn't the type to follow the crowd. She thought for herself, spoke her mind, and refused to be anyone other than who she was. Her parents raised her to be strong, to be resilient, to stand up for herself in a world that didn't always make things easy. She had striking features: long, dark hair, bright, expressive eyes, a smile that could light up a room when she chose to share it. But Brianna wasn't interested in fitting into any particular mold. She dressed the way she wanted, listened to the music she loved, and made friends with people who accepted her for exactly who she was. By the time she reached her teenage years, Brianna had developed a deep love for animals. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day, a goal she spoke about often with anyone who would listen. She wanted to help animals, to care for them, to give them the kind of compassion and attention they deserved. It was a dream rooted in genuine kindness, in a desire to make the world a little bit better. But Brianna's teenage years weren't without struggle. High school had been difficult for her. She attended Bellows Free Academy in St. Albans, a larger school where she sometimes felt out of place. Brianna was different. She didn't dress like the other girls. She didn't act like them either. And in the cruel social ecosystem of high school, being different often meant being targeted. Brianna was bullied. Relentlessly. It started with whispers, with looks, with the kind of subtle cruelty that teenagers can be so adept at delivering. But it escalated. There were rumors. There were confrontations. And one day it turned physical. Brianna was jumped by a group of girls, attacked in a moment of senseless violence that left her shaken and angry. She fought back, of course. Brianna wasn't the type to just take abuse lying down. But the incident left scars, both physical and emotional. After that, Brianna made a decision. She dropped out of high school. It wasn't a decision her parents were thrilled about, but they understood. They saw how much their daughter was suffering, how the school environment had become toxic for her. So they supported her when she chose to pursue her GED instead, to take control of her education on her own terms. By early 2004, Brianna was living on her own in a rented apartment in Sheldon, Vermont, a small town not far from her parents' home. She was working at the Black Lantern Inn to support herself, saving money, and planning to take her G test in the coming weeks. She was determined to get her life on track to move forward, to eventually pursue that dream of becoming a veterinarian. Her parents were proud of her. Despite everything she had been through, Brianna was making it work. She was independent, responsible, and focused on building a future for herself. She called her mother regularly. She checked in with her father. She visited her brother. Her family knew she was okay. She was struggling at times, sure, but she was okay. And then on the night of March 19, 2004, everything changed. The days leading up to Brianna's disappearance seemed, on the surface, relatively normal. She went to work. She came home. She spent time with friends. But if you look closer, if you examine the details of her life in those final days, small cracks begin to appear. Brianna had recently moved into her apartment in Sheldon. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was hers. She shared it with a friend, a roommate who helped split the rent. The two got along well enough, though Brianna's work schedule at the Black Lantern Inn often meant she was coming and going at odd hours. In the days before she vanished, Brianna mentioned to her mother that she was having some trouble at her apartment. She didn't go into great detail, but she said there had been a drug-related incident. Someone had broken into the apartment, or at least that's what Brianna suspected. She didn't elaborate much, and her mother didn't press her on it at the time. It seemed like a minor issue, something that would blow over. But looking back, that offhand comment takes on a more sinister tone. Was Brianna involved with people who were dangerous? Was she aware of something she shouldn't have been? Had she witnessed something or angered someone without fully realizing the consequences? Her friends later said that Brianna had seemed a bit on edge in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Not dramatically so, but there was a subtle tension beneath the surface. She was more cautious than usual. She checked over her shoulder more often. She seemed distracted at times, as though her mind was somewhere else. One friend recalled Brianna mentioning that she felt like she was being watched. It was a vague, uneasy feeling, the kind of thing that's easy to dismiss as paranoia or overthinking. But Brianna mentioned it more than once. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone's eyes were on her. Another detail that stands out: Brianna had recently reconnected with some old acquaintances, people she knew from her time in high school. These weren't close friends necessarily, but people she had crossed paths with over the years. Some of them had reputations. Some of them were involved in things that Brianna, by all accounts, wanted nothing to do with. But in a small town, it's hard to completely avoid anyone. Paths cross, conversations happen, and sometimes those brief interactions lead to consequences no one could have predicted. On the evening of March 19th, Brianna arrived at the Black Lantern Inn for her shift. She was scheduled to work as a dishwasher, a job she'd held for several months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and Brianna took it seriously. She was reliable, she showed up on time. She did her job without complaint. That night, everything seemed normal. She clocked in, put on her apron, and got to work. Her co-workers later said she seemed fine. Maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. She joked around with the other staff. She handled her tasks efficiently. There was no indication that anything was wrong. But one small detail stands out. At some point during her shift, Brianna mentioned to a co-worker that she had recently been in contact with two old friends, individuals whose names would later become deeply significant in the investigation. She didn't say much about them, just that she'd seen them recently, that they'd talked. It was a casual comment, the kind of thing you mention in passing and then forget about, except Brianna's co-worker remembered it. And later, when Brianna vanished, that comment would become a crucial piece of the puzzle. The shift ended around 11:20 p.m. Brianna clocked out, said goodnight to her co-workers, and headed for the door. One of the staff members watched her walk to her car, saw her climb inside, saw the taillights flicker on as she started the engine. That was the last confirmed sighting of Brianna Maitland. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove off into the night, heading east on Route 18. The road was dark, quiet, bordered by trees and fields that disappeared into shadows. It was a route she'd driven countless times before. A short drive, maybe 10 minutes to her apartment. But Brianna never made it home. And what happened in those 10 minutes, in the space between the Black Lantern Inn and her apartment, remains a mystery that has haunted Vermont for nearly 2 decades. The next morning, Saturday, March 20th, 2004, dawned cold and gray. The sun rose over the Vermont hills, casting pale light across the rural landscape. Life went on as it always did. People woke up, they made coffee. They went about their routines. But at an old, abandoned farmhouse on Route 118, just about a mile from the Black Lantern Inn, something was very, very wrong. The farmhouse had been empty for years. It sat back from the road, a decaying structure that no one paid much attention to anymore. The property was overgrown, forgotten, the kind of place that blended into the background of daily life. People drove past it all the time without giving it a second thought. But on that Saturday morning, anyone who passed by couldn't help but notice something unusual. There was a car, a green 1985 Oldsmobile sedan, and it was backed into the side of the old farmhouse, nose facing out toward the road, rear end wedged against the building with such force that it looked almost intentional, almost staged. The driver's side door was wide open. At first, passers-by assumed it was an accident. Someone had crashed, maybe had a bit too much to drink, maybe lost control of their vehicle in the dark. It wasn't uncommon in rural Vermont, especially on winding roads late at night. Someone probably called for help and walked away to find a phone or catch a ride. But as the morning wore on, the car remained. No one came back for it. No one called it in. It just sat there abandoned, wedged against the farmhouse like a silent sentinel. It wasn't until later that day that someone finally thought to call the police. The Vermont State Police arrived at the scene in the early afternoon. They approached the vehicle cautiously, taking in the strange positioning, the open door, the eerie stillness of it all. The car's rear bumper was pressed firmly against the farmhouse's old wooden siding, but the damage to the building was minimal. The car itself showed signs of impact, but nothing catastrophic. No shattered wind airbags, no blood. The officers peered inside. Brianna's belongings were still there. Her work uniform, a black jacket, was draped over the back seat. Her contact lens case sat on the dashboard. Loose change littered the center console. A few personal items were scattered across the seats. But there was no Brianna. The keys were missing. The car had been turned off, but there were no keys in the ignition, no keys anywhere in the vehicle. Whoever had been driving had taken them. The positioning of the car bothered the officers immediately. It wasn't consistent with a typical accident. If Brianna had lost control of her vehicle, if she'd swerved off the road and crashed, the car would have been facing a different direction. The front would have hit the building, not the back. But this car had been backed into the farmhouse, deliberately, with force. And then there was the door, wide open, as though someone had gotten out in a hurry, or ever had the chance to close it. The officers ran the plates. The car was registered to Brianna Maitland. They contacted her family. Bruce Maitland answered the phone. He listened as the officer explained that his daughter's car had been found abandoned on Route 118. Brianna was missing. His world shattered in that moment. Bruce and Kelly immediately drove to the scene. When they arrived, they saw their daughter's car wedged against the farmhouse, saw the open door, saw the belongings still inside. Panic clawed at their chests. Where was she? What had happened? They tried calling Brianna's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. They called her friends. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her since she left work the night before. Kelly Maitland began to cry. Bruce Maitland felt his stomach twist into knots. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The police began their investigation immediately. They processed the car, looking for fingerprints, for signs of a struggle, for anything that might explain what had happened. They found Brianna's belongings, but they also found something else. Inside the car, on the back seat, there were 2 uncashed paychecks made out to Brianna. She had worked hard for that money. She needed that money, and yet she had left it behind. That detail alone told investigators that whatever had happened, Brianna hadn't left willingly. She wouldn't have abandoned her paychecks. She wouldn't have left her belongings. She wouldn't have walked away from her car and disappeared into the night without a word to anyone. Something had happened to her. Something terrible. But what? The area around the farmhouse was searched extensively. Police combed through the overgrown fields, checked the abandoned building, looked for any sign of Brianna. They brought in search dogs. They scoured the woods. They checked nearby properties.
Nothing, no footprints, no clothing.
No blood. No sign of a struggle beyond the bizarre positioning of the car itself. It was as though Brianna Maitland had simply vanished into thin air. The Vermont State Police knew they were dealing with something unusual. The circumstances of Brianna's disappearance didn't fit any neat, predictable pattern. This wasn't a clear-cut abduction. It wasn't an obvious accident. It was something stranger. Something more unsettling. Detectives began interviewing everyone who had seen Brianna in the hours before she vanished. Her co-workers at the Black Len Inn were questioned extensively. They all told the same story. Brianna had seemed fine. She'd worked her shift. She'd left around 11:20 p.m. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. One co-worker, however, mentioned something that caught the detectives' attention. She said that Brianna had been talking recently about two individuals. Two people from her past who she'd reconnected with. The co-worker didn't know many details, but she remembered the conversation because Brianna had seemed a bit uncomfortable when their names came up. Who were these people? What was their connection to Brianna? And could they have had anything to do with her disappearance? Detectives made a note of it and continued their interviews. Brianna's family provided as much information as they could. They told police about Brianna's life, her struggles in high school, her decision to drop out, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. They mentioned the incident at her apartment, the drug-related break, and that Brianna had mentioned to her mother. That detail became a focal point. Police began looking into Brianna's apartment, her roommate, and anyone who might have had access to the place. Was Brianna involved in something dangerous? Had she witnessed something she shouldn't have? Detectives also learned that Brianna had recently been in contact with several individuals who had checkered pasts. Some of them had criminal records. Some of them were involved in the local drug scene. It wasn't clear how deep Brianna's connections to these people went, but the investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that she'd gotten mixed up in something over her head. Then there was the car itself. The green Oldsmobile backed into the farmhouse, door wide open. Forensic teams processed it thoroughly, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fibers, analyzing every inch of the interior. They found several sets of fingerprints. Some belonged to Brianna. Others belonged to people she knew, friends who had ridden in her car before. But there were also unidentified prints, smudges and partials that couldn't be matched to anyone in the system. Whose prints were they? Had someone else been in the car that night? Had someone driven it to the farmhouse after Brianna was gone? The back seat was examined closely. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence. But there were a few fibers, a few hairs that didn't match Brianna's. They were collected and sent for analysis. Investigators also focused on the car's positioning. Why had it been backed into the farmhouse? What was the purpose? Some theories emerged. Theory 1: Brianna had pulled over for some reason, perhaps to meet someone, and had backed into the farmhouse's driveway area to turn around. She got out of the car, and something happened. She was abducted, taken by force, and her car was left behind. Theory 2: someone else had driven the car to that location after Brianna was already gone. They deliberately positioned it against the farmhouse to make it visible from the road, perhaps as a message, or perhaps to dispose of it in a way that would eventually be found. Theory 3: Brianna had been followed from the Black Lantern Inn. Someone had pursued her, forced her off the road, and confronted her at the farmhouse. A struggle ensued. She was taken, and her car was left behind as evidence of the encounter. None of the theories fit perfectly. Each one had gaps, unanswered questions, pieces that didn't quite align. The investigators working Brianna's case knew they needed to move quickly. The first 48 hours after a disappear critical. Evidence degrades, memories fade, trails go cold. And with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding Brianna alive diminished. The Vermont State Police established a command center and began coordinating search efforts across the region. Volunteers from the community joined in, combing through forests, checking abandoned buildings, searching along riverbanks and roadways. Brianna's face appeared on missing person flyers that were distributed throughout Vermont and neighboring states. Her parents, Bruce and Kelly Maitland, were consumed by anguish. They gave interviews to local news stations, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Kelly's voice trembled as she spoke about her daughter, describing Brianna as a loving, independent young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. Bruce stood beside his wife, his jaw clenched, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and despair. "Someone knows something," Bruce said to the cameras. "Someone saw something that night. Please, if you have any information at all, contact the police. We just want our daughter back." The media coverage brought attention to the case, but it also brought something else: tips. Lots of them. The police tip line was flooded with calls. Some were legitimate leads. Others were well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful observations. And some were the work of conspiracy theorists and attention seekers who seemed more interested in inserting themselves into a tragedy than actually helping. Detectives had to sift through every single tip, evaluate its credibility, and follow up on anything that seemed remotely promising. It was exhausting, painstaking work. But they couldn't afford to ignore anything. Not when a young woman's life hung in the balance. One of the first major leads came from a witness who lived near the old farmhouse where Brianna's car was found. The woman's name was never publicly released, but her testimony became crucial to the investigation. She lived in a house along Route 118, not far from the abandoned farmhouse. On the night of March 19th, she'd been awake late, unable to sleep. At some point between midnight and 12:30 a.m., she heard something outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinctive enough to catch her attention. The sound of a car, not just passing by, but stopping. Idling, she went to her window and looked out into the darkness. The road was poorly lit, and her view was partially obscured by trees, but she could make out shapes. There was a vehicle parked near the old farmhouse, and there appeared to be people standing near it. She couldn't see how many. She couldn't make out any details about who they were. Just silhouettes moving in the darkness. The woman didn't think much of it at the time. People sometimes pulled over along that stretch of road. Maybe someone was having car trouble. Maybe they were lost in checking a map. It didn't seem particularly suspicious. After a few minutes, she turned away from the window and went back to whatever she'd been doing. When she looked out again, the vehicle was gone. The next morning, when she saw the green Oldsmobile wedged against the farmhouse, she realized what she'd witnessed. She immediately called the police and told them what she'd seen. Detectives questioned her extensively. Could she describe the vehicle she'd seen? No, it had been too dark, and she'd only caught a glimpse. Could she say how many people were there? At least 2. She thought maybe more. It was hard to tell. Could she describe any of the individuals? No, everything had been shadows and shapes. Her testimony was valuable but frustratingly vague. It confirmed that something had happened at the farmhouse in the hours after Brianna left work. It suggested that Brianna hadn't been alone. But it didn't provide enough detail to identify who had been there or what exactly had occurred. Still, it was something, a thread to pull on, a direction to investigate. The detectives began focusing on the timeline. Brianna had left the Black Lantern Inn at approximately 11:20 p.m. The distance from the inn to the farmhouse was roughly a mile. Under normal driving conditions, it would take 2 or 3 minutes to cover that distance. But Brianna's car had been seen at the farmhouse sometime between midnight and 12:30 a.m. That meant there was a gap of at least 40 minutes, possibly more than an hour, between when Brianna left work and when her car appeared at the farmhouse. Where had she been during that time? Had she driven straight to the farmhouse and waited there for someone? Had she gone somewhere else first? Had she been taken somewhere before her car was abandoned? Investigators checked the route between the Black Lantern Inn and the farmhouse. They looked for security cameras, for other witnesses, for any piece of evidence that might fill in that missing time. But Route 118 was a rural road. There were no traffic cameras, no convenience stores with surveillance footage, no brightly lit intersections where someone might have noticed a green Oldsmobile passing by. It was just darkness and silence. Another troubling detail emerged during the investigation: Brianna's movements in the hours before she went to work. That afternoon before her shift at the Black Lantern Inn, Brianna had visited her friend Jillian Stout. The two had known each other for years, and though they didn't see each other constantly, they'd remained close. Brianna showed up at Jillian's house unannounced, which wasn't unusual. The two young women hung out, talked, smoked some marijuana together. It was a casual, relaxed visit. Nothing seemed wrong. Brianna was in good spirits, perhaps a bit tired from her schedule, but otherwise normal. She mentioned that she had to work that night, that she needed to head to the Black Lantern Inn soon. Before she left, Brianna said, something Jillian would later recall with chilling clarity. "If I don't come back," Brianna said, half joking, "you'll know something happened to me." Jillian laughed it off at the time. It seemed like a throwaway comment, the kind of dark humor young people sometimes indulge in. Brianna had a bit of a sardonic streak. She wasn't the type to be overly dramatic or paranoid. But in hindsight, after Brianna disappeared, those words took on a different weight. Had Brianna known she was in danger? Had she sensed that something was about to happen? Or was it truly just a random comment? A coincidence that only seemed significant after the fact. Jillian told investigators about the visit, about the marijuana, about Brianna's mood. She also mentioned that Brianna had seemed a bit distracted, as though she had something on her mind. When Jillian asked if everything was okay, Brianna brushed it off. "Just dealing with some stuff," she'd said vaguely. What stuff? Jillian didn't know. Brianna hadn't elaborated. Detectives pressed Jillian for more details. Did Brianna mention anyone she was afraid of? Did she talk about any conflicts or problems she was having? Jillian thought hard, trying to remember. There was one thing. Brianna had mentioned, in passing, that she'd recently been in contact with two people from her past. She didn't say much about them, just that she'd run into them, that they'd talk. The same two names that had come up in the conversation with Brianna's co-worker at the Black Lantern Inn. Detectives now had multiple sources pointing to these two individuals. Whoever they were, they'd been on Brianna's mind in the days before she vanished, and investigators were determined to find out why. The two individuals Brianna had mentioned were identified relatively quickly. Their names were Raymond Ryans and Nathaniel Jackson. Both were known to local law enforcement. Both had criminal records, and both had connections to Brianna that dated back years. Raymond Ryans was in his early 20s, a tall, thin man with a reputation for violence and drug dealing. He'd been in and out of trouble with the law since his teenage years, racking up charges for assault, drug possession, and theft. He wasn't someone you wanted to cross. Nathaniel Jackson, also in his 20s, was Ryan's close associate. The two were frequently seen together, and they were both deeply involved in the local drug trade. Jackson had his own criminal history, including charges related to narcotics and weapon possession. How did Brianna know these men? The connection was complicated, rooted in the tangled social networks of small-town Vermont. Brianna had attended school with people who knew Ryans and Jackson. She'd been to parties where they were present. She'd crossed paths with them over the years, though she'd never been particularly close to either of them. But recently, something had changed. Brianna had been in contact with them again. Why? That was the question detectives desperately needed answered. Investigators brought Ryans and Jackson in for questioning. Both men agreed to talk, though their attorney was present, and they were careful about what they said. Raymond Ryans sat across from the detectives, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He admitted that he knew Brianna. Yes, he'd seen her recently. They'd run into each other somewhere, he couldn't remember exactly where, and they'd chatted briefly. "What did you talk about?" the detective asked. "Nothing important, just catching up. Small talk." "Did you see her on the night she disappeared?" "No." "Where were you that night?" Ryans provided an alibi. He claimed he'd been at home, hanging out with friends, watching TV. He rattled off names of people who could supposedly confirm his story. The detectives made notes. They'd follow up on the alibi, verify it, see if it held up under scrutiny. "Did Brianna ever mention anything to you about being in trouble? About being afraid?" Ryans shook his head. "No, she seemed fine when I saw her." "When was the last time you saw her?" "I don't know. A week before she went missing, maybe. I don't keep track of dates." The interview continued, but Ryans didn't give them much. He was evasive when he needed to be, cooperative when it suited him. He denied any involvement in Brianna's disappearance. He claimed he had no idea what had happened to her. Nathaniel Jackson's interview followed a similar pattern. He admitted knowing Brianna. He admitted seeing her recently. But he denied having anything to do with her disappearance. His alibi mirrored Ryan's. He'd been at home that night with friends doing nothing in particular. Both men came across as calm, almost bored. If they were hiding something, they were doing a good job of concealing it. But the detectives weren't convinced. There was something off about the way men had told their stories. Their alibis were too neat, too convenient, and their connection to Brianna, combined with their criminal backgrounds, made them prime suspects. Investigators began digging into Ryan's and Jackson's lives. They interviewed their associates, checked their phone records, looked into their whereabouts on the night Brianna disappeared. And that's when things started to get interesting. One of Ryan's acquaintances, a man who'd known him for years, came forward with information. He didn't want to be identified publicly, but he was willing to talk to police. According to this witness, Raymond Ryans had been acting strangely in the days after Brianna's disappearance. Normally, Ryans was loud, boastful, the kind of guy who loved to talk about himself. But after Brianna went missing, he'd become quiet, withdrawn, almost paranoid. He kept saying the cops were going to try to pin it on him, the witness said. He was worried they'd blame him for something he didn't do. The witness also mentioned that Ryans had sold his truck shortly after Brianna vanished. It was an older pickup, nothing fancy, but Ryans had owned it for years. Suddenly, within days of Brianna's disappearance, he got rid of it. Detectives located the truck. It had been sold to a private buyer who still owned it. They brought it in for forensic analysis, searching for any evidence that might link it to Brianna or to the night she disappeared. The results were inconclusive. There were no traces of Brianna's DNA in the truck, no blood, no fibers that matched anything connected to her. But the truck had been cleaned thoroughly before it was sold, which raised suspicions. Had Ryans been trying to destroy evidence? Investigators also learned something else about Ryans and Jackson. In the weeks before Brianna's disappearance, both men had been staying at a farmhouse in the area. Not the abandoned farmhouse where Brianna's car was found, but another one, a property that was used as a sort of crash pad for people in their social circle. This farmhouse was known to be a place where drugs were sold and used. People came and went at all hours. It was chaotic, unsupervised, the kind of environment where anything could happen. Had Brianna been to that farmhouse? Had she gone there the night she disappeared? Detectives interviewed people who'd been staying at the farmhouse around that time. Some were cooperative. Others were hostile, refusing to talk, invoking their right to remain silent. A few admitted that Brianna had been Edo and not recently. She'd stopped by once or twice in the past, usually with friends, never staying long. One person, a young woman who'd been living at the farmhouse temporarily, said something that made the detective's ears perk up. Brianna owed someone money, the woman said. I heard people talking about it. She'd borrowed money from someone and hadn't paid it back. Oh, the detective asked. The woman shrugged. I don't know. But people were pissed about it. This was a new angle. If Brianna had been in debt to someone involved in the drug trade, that could have been a motive for violence. Drug dealers didn't take kindly to people who owed them money and couldn't pay. But was it true? Brianna's family insisted she wasn't involved in drugs beyond recreational marijuana use. She didn't have the kind of money to be buying drugs in any significant quantity. And she was working hard, saving her paychecks, trying to build a stable life for herself. Still, the detectives couldn't ignore the possibility. They added it to the growing list of theories and continued their investigation. Another suspect emerged from the periphery of the case. His name was Michael, a local man in his 30s who had a reputation for being volatile and unpredictable. He'd had several run-ins with the law over the years, mostly for assault and domestic violence. Michael's connection to Brianna was tenuous at best. They'd never been friends. They'd never dated. But Michael had been at the Lantern Inn on the night Brianna disappeared. He'd been drinking at the bar. and he'd left around the same time Brianna finished her shift. Witnesses at the inn mentioned seeing Michael that night, though no one paid much attention to him. He was a regular, someone who came in fairly often, drank alone, and usually left without causing trouble. But one detail caught the attention of investigators. Michael had left the bar shortly before Brianna did. He'd walked out to the parking lot, gotten into his truck, and driven off. In which direction? East, the same direction Brianna had gone. Detectives brought Michael in for questioning. He was defensive from the start, irritated that he was being treated as a suspect. "I didn't do anything to that girl," he said, his voice rising. "I don't even know her." "But you were at the Black Lantern Inn the night she disappeared." "So what? Lots of people were there. And you left around the same time she did." "That's a coincidence." The detectives pressed him. Where had he gone after leaving the inn? "Straight home," he claimed. "Did anyone see him at home?" "No, he lived alone." "Could anyone verify his alibi?" Michael's lack of an alibi was concerning, but it wasn't proof of anything. Plenty of people live alone. Plenty of people don't have witnesses to account for every moment of their day. Still, the detectives dug deeper. They checked Michael's truck for evidence, looking for any sign that Brianna had been inside it. They found nothing, no DNA, no fibers. No indication that Brianna had ever been in his vehicle. They also looked into Michael's background, searching for any history of violence against women. What they found was troubling. Michael had been accused of assaulting his ex-girlfriend years earlier. The charges had been dropped, but the incident was documented. He had a temper. He had a history of lashing out when he felt wronged or disrespected. Could he have encountered Brianna on the road that night? Could something have happened between them? Some interaction that escalated into violence? It was possible. But without evidence, it was just speculation. Michael remained on the list of potential suspects, but investigators couldn't build a case against him. Not yet. As the investigation continued, more witnesses came forward with information, some helpful, some less so. A man who'd been driving along Route 118 on the night of March 19th contacted police. He said he'd seen a green car pull over on the side of the road, near the old farmhouse, sometime around 11:45 p.m. He hadn't stopped, hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but when he heard about Brianna's disappearance, he realized it might have been her car. Detectives interviewed him. Could he describe the car in more detail? It had been dark, he said, and he'd only seen it for a second as he drove past. But he was fairly certain it was a sedan, green or dark colored. Was anyone near the car? He didn't think so, but he couldn't be sure. Another witness, a woman who lived a few miles from the farmhouse, reported seeing a suspicious vehicle parked along a side road on the night Brianna disappeared. It was a dark, colored truck or SUV, she thought, though she couldn't be certain. She'd noticed it because it was parked in an odd spot, partially hidden by trees, as though whoever was driving didn't want to be seen. When she drove past again an hour later, the vehicle was gone. Could this have been connected to Brianna's disappearance? Investigators didn't know, but they documented the sighting and added it to their files. A third witness, a teenager who'd been out late that night, claimed to have seen a young woman matching Brianna's description walking along 118 sometime after midnight. She'd been alone, the witness said, moving quickly as though she was in a hurry or upset. The detectives were skeptical. If Brianna had been walking along the road, why would she have left her car behind? And why hadn't anyone else seen her? They interviewed the teenager extensively, trying to determine whether his account was credible. He stuck to his story, insisting he'd seen someone who looked like Brianna. But he couldn't provide any additional details, and there was no way to verify his claim. Was he telling the truth? Or had he simply seen someone else, someone who happened to resemble Brianna, and convinced himself it was her? The detectives couldn't be sure. They filed the report and moved on. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Brianna's car was yielding some results, though not the breakthrough investigators had hoped for. The fingerprints found in the vehicle were examined carefully. Most belonged to Brianna as expected. A few belonged to her friends, people who'd ridden in her car before. But there were several prints that couldn't be identified. Smudges and partials that didn't match anyone in the police database. Could these prints belong to whoever had been with Brianna the night she disappeared? It was possible. But without a suspect to compare them to, the prints were essentially useless. The fibers and hairs collected from lab for analysis. Some matched Brianna's DNA. Others belonged to people she knew. But there were a few fibers that stood out, synthetic materials that didn't match anything Brianna owned. Where had they come from? Had they been transferred from someone else's clothing? Had they come from the interior of another vehicle? If Brianna had been moved from her car to somewhere else? The lab couldn't say for certain. The fibers were consistent with common materials used in clothing and car interiors. They could have come from anywhere. Investigators also examined the car's exterior for paint transfers or other evidence that might indicate it had been in contact with another vehicle. They found minor scratches and scuffs, but nothing that suggested a collision or forced contact. The car's mechanical condition was assessed as well. Everything was in working order. The engine ran fine. The brakes functioned properly. There was no reason Brianna would have needed to pull over due to car trouble. So why had the car ended up at the farmhouse? And why had it been positioned so deliberately against the building? Detectives returned to the farmhouse itself, searching for clues they might have missed. They examined the building's exterior, looking for damage, for marks, for anything that might explain the car's strange placement. What they found was minimal. The car had struck the building with enough force to leave a small indentation in the wood siding, but the damage was superficial. The car's rear bumper had absorbed most of the impact. Inside the farmhouse, investigators searched for signs that Brianna had been there. They looked for blood, for clothing, for any indication that she'd entered the building or been held there. They found nothing. The farmhouse was empty, decaying, filled with debris and the smell of rot. If Brianna had been there, she'd left no trace. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to notice inconsistencies and contradictions in the evidence they gathered. The witness who'd seen activity near the farmhouse around midnight said there had been at least 2 people present, possibly more. But other witnesses who'd driven past the area that night hadn't seen anything unusual. How could multiple people have been at the farmhouse without being noticed by other passers-by? The teenager who claimed to have seen Brianna walking along the road said it was after midnight. But if Brianna had left her car at the farmhouse, why would she have been walking along Route 118? And if she'd been taken against her will, why would her abductor have let her wander around on foot? The story didn't add up. Raymond Rhines and Nathaniel Jackson's alibis were verified, at least partially. People confirmed that both men had been at the locations they claimed, though the exact timing was fuzzy. Some witnesses said they'd seen Jackson around 11 p.m. Others said it was closer to 1 a.m. The discrepancies made it difficult to rule them out completely, but also difficult to build a solid case against them. Michael, the man from the Black Lantern Inn, remained a person of interest, but there was no physical evidence linking him to Brianna's disappearance. His truck had been searched. His home had been searched. Nothing, and then there was the matter of Brianna's cell phone. It had never been found, not in her car, not at the farmhouse, not anywhere. If Brianna had been abducted, her abductor had likely taken her phone to prevent her from calling for help. But investigators couldn't track the phone's location. It had either been turned off, destroyed, or discarded in a place where it would never be found. Without the phone, another potential source of evidence was lost. The case was becoming increasingly frustrating. There were leads, suspects, and theories, but nothing concrete. Nothing that could definitively answer the question of what had happened to Brianna Maitland on the night of March 19, 2004. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Brianna Maitland's disappearance became one of the most intensive missing person cases in Vermont's history. The Vermont State Police dedicated significant resources to the case, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, and pursuing theories that ranged from plausible to far-fetched. But despite their efforts, Brianna remained missing, and her family remained trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Bruce and Kelly Maitland refused to give up hope. They appeared on national television programs, including coverage on major news networks and true crime shows. They distributed thousands of flyers, They hired private investigators. They offered a reward for information leading to Brianna's whereabouts. Kelly Maitland spoke at press conferences, her voice steady despite the tears that often threatened to fall. "Brianna's out there somewhere," she would say. "Someone knows what happened to her. Please, if you have any information, no matter how small it might seem, come forward. Help us bring our daughter home." Bruce Maitland was more reserved in public, but those who knew him could see the toll the investigation was taking. He aged visibly in the months after Brianna's disappearance. The lines on his face deepened. His shoulders seemed to carry an unbearable weight. But he never stopped searching, never stopped demanding answers. The community rallied around the Maitland family. Fundraisers were held to support the search efforts. Volunteers organized regular search parties, combing through woods and fields, checking abandoned buildings, looking for any sign of Brianna. Local businesses displayed her missing person poster in their windows. Churches held prayer vigils. But as time passed, the initial surge of public attention began to fade. Other stories dominated the news. Other tragedies captured people's attention, and slowly, inevitably, Brianna's case began to slip from the headlines. For the investigators working the case, however, the work never stopped. One theory that investigators kept returning to was the possibility that Brianna's disappearance was connected to the drug trade in the area. Montgomery and the surrounding towns in northern Vermont had, like many rural communities in America, been affected by the spread of drug use, particularly methamphetamine and cocaine. The drug trade brought with it violence, instability, and a criminal element that operated in the shadows. Raymond Ryans and Nathaniel Jackson were deeply embedded in this world. Both men dealt drugs. Both had connections to suppliers and distributors. Both had reputations for using violence when necessary to protect their business interests. If Brianna had become entangled with Ryans and Jackson, even peripherally, she could have found herself in danger without fully understanding the stakes. Detectives theorized several possible scenarios. Scenario 1: Brianna had witnessed something she shouldn't have. Perhaps she'd been at the farmhouse where Ryans and Jackson were staying and had seen a drug deal go wrong, or had overheard information about their operations. Fearing she might go to the police, they decided to silence her permanently. Scenario 2: Brianna owed money to someone in the drug trade. Perhaps she'd bought drugs on credit and couldn't pay. Or perhaps she'd borrowed money from the wrong people. When she couldn't repay the debt, violence was the result. Scenario 3: Brianna had been used as a scapegoat. Perhaps there was a dispute within the drug network, and Brianna became a convenient victim, someone who could be blamed for a theft or a betrayal she had nothing to do with. All three scenarios were plausible, but proving any of them was another matter entirely. Investigators continued to pressure Ryans and Jackson, bringing them in for additional questioning, searching their properties, monitoring their movements. Both men lawyered up, refusing to cooperate beyond their initial statements. They denied any involvement in Brianna's disappearance. They claimed they barely knew her. They insisted the police were harassing them, but their behavior suggested otherwise. In the months after Brianna vanished, both Ryans and Jackson became increasingly paranoid. They stopped using their regular phones, switching to burner phones instead. They moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. They cut ties with people they'd known for years, isolating themselves from their previous social circles. To the investigators watching them, this behavior screamed guilt. Innocent people didn't act this way. Innocent people didn't depend their entire lives in response to a police investigation unless they had something to hide. But paranoia and guilty behavior weren't the same as evidence. And without evidence, the detectives couldn't make an arrest. One lead that seemed particularly promising came from an informant within the drug community. The informant, whose identity was kept strictly confidential, came forward with explosive allegations. According to this person, Brianna had been at the farmhouse where Ryans and Jackson were staying on the night she disappeared. She'd gone there to confront them about something, though the informant wasn't clear on the details. An argument had ensued, things got heated, and then things got violent. Ryans had struck Brianna during the argument. She'd fallen, hit her head, and either died or was severely injured. Panicking, Ryans and Jackson had disposed of her body, then driven her car to the abandoned farmhouse on Route 118 and staged it to look like she'd been in an accident or had run away. The informant claimed to have heard this story from someone who'd been at the farmhouse that night, though they refused to identify that person directly. Detectives were skeptical but intrigued. The story had elements that fit the known facts. It explained why Brianna's car had been found at the farmhouse. It explained why she'd never contacted her family. It explained why Ryans and Jackson had been acting so suspiciously. But there were also problems with the informant's story. For one thing, if Brianna had died at the farmhouse where Ryans and Jackson were staying, there should have been evidence. Blood, DNA, something. But when police had searched that property, they'd found nothing. For another, the informant had a history of providing unreliable information. They'd been arrested multiple times for drug-related offenses and had tried to negotiate reduced sentences by offering tips to law enforcement. Some of those tips had panned out. Others had been dead ends or outright fabrications. Was this informant telling the truth, or were they spinning a story to gain favor with the police? Investigators decided to pursue the lead, but cautiously. They re-examined the farmhouse where Ryans and Jackson had been staying, using more advanced forensic techniques this time. They brought in luminol, a chemical that can detect traces of blood even after it's been cleaned up. They sprayed the floors, the walls, the furniture, and they found something. In one room of the farmhouse, in a corner near the baseboards, luminol revealed a faint reaction. It was a small area, just a few inches across, but it glowed under the ultraviolet light. Blood, the investigators' hearts raced. This could be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. They carefully collected samples and sent them to the lab for DNA analysis. The wait for the results was agonizing. Days turned into weeks. The lab was backlogged, processing evidence from multiple cases. The detectives followed up repeatedly, pushing for priority, but there was only so much they could do. Finally, the results came back. The blood did contain human DNA, but it wasn't Brianna's. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had no known connection to the case. Further investigation revealed that the person had been staying at the farmhouse months before Brianna disappeared and had cut themselves in a minor accident. The blood had nothing to do with Brianna. It was a crushing disappointment. For a brief moment, the investigators had thought they were on the verge of solving the case. But once again they were back to square one. As the official investigation continued, alternative theories about Brianna's disappearance began to circulate, both within law enforcement and among the public. Some people believed Brianna had run away voluntarily. Perhaps the pressures of her life, the bullying she'd experienced, the struggles of living on her own at 17, had become too much. Perhaps she decided to leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. But this theory had significant problems. Brianna had left behind her paychecks, money she desperately needed. She'd left behind her belongings, including items she cared about. And most importantly, she'd never contacted her family, not even once, in all the years since she disappeared. Brianna was close with her parents. She called them regularly. She visited them. She relied on them for support. It was completely out of character for her to vanish without a word, to let them suffer and worry indefinitely. Her family rejected the runaway theory entirely. Brianna would never do that to us. Kelly Maitland insisted never. Another theory suggested that Brianna had been the victim of a random crime, perhaps a sexual predator who'd been passing through the area. Vermont, despite its reputation as a safe rural state, had its share of violent criminals. Perhaps Brianna had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. This theory was certainly possible, but it didn't explain the strange positioning of her car at the farmhouse. A random predator would have abducted Brianna and driven her away, or would have left her car somewhere less conspicuous. The deliberate staging at the farmhouse suggested that whoever was responsible had a specific reason for leaving the car there, a message they wanted to send or a distraction they wanted to create. A third theory involved human trafficking. Some people speculated that Brianna had been targeted by traffickers, kidnapped, and sold into a network that operated across state lines or even internationally. Vermont's proximity to the Canadian border made this theory somewhat plausible. Human traffickers could have taken Brianna across the border relatively easily, especially in 2004 when border security wasn't as stringent as it later became. But again, there were issues with this theory. Human traffickers typically target vulnerable individuals who won't be immediately missed: runaways, homeless people, those without strong family connections. Brianna had a close, knit family who reported her missing right away. She had friends who knew her routine. She had employers who expected her to show up for work. Traffickers usually prefer to avoid high-profile cases that generate media attention and intensive police investigations. Brianna's disappearance had become exactly that. Still, investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility. They contacted agencies that specialized in human trafficking cases, shared Brianna's information, and asked them to keep an eye out for any leads. Nothing ever came of it. One aspect of the case that continued to perplex investigators was the abandoned farmhouse itself, the location where Brianna's car had been found. Why that particular location? The farmhouse was old, dilapidated, and had been abandoned for years. It sat along 118, visible from the road but not exactly prominent. Most people who drove past it barely gave it a second glance. It was just another decaying building in rural Vermont, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But someone had chosen that farmhouse specifically. They'd driven Brianna's car there, positioned it against the building, and left. Why? Some investigators believed the location was chosen because it was familiar to whoever was responsible. Perhaps they'd been to the farmhouse before. Perhaps they knew it was abandoned and unlikely to be disturbed. Others thought the location was symbolic, a message left for someone who would understand its significance. Detectives dug into the history of the farmhouse. They learned that it had once been a working farm, owned by a family who'd lived for generations. But economic hardship had forced the family to sell the property decades earlier. It had changed hands several times, eventually falling into disrepair when the owners stopped maintaining it. In recent years, the farmhouse had become a local curiosity, a place teenagers sometimes visited on dares, a location where people occasionally dumped trash or used as a shortcut to access the fields beyond. Had Brianna known about the farmhouse? Had she been there before? Her friends and family said no. Brianna had never mentioned the place. As far as they knew, she'd never had any reason to go there. But that didn't mean she hadn't been taken there against her will. Investigators conducted multiple searches of the farmhouse and the surrounding property. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human remains. The dogs were walked through the building, around the perimeter, and across the adjacent fields. The dogs didn't alert to anything. Either Brianna had never been inside the farmhouse, or she'd been there only briefly, not long enough to leave a scent trail that would persist over time. Detectives also checked the basement of the farmhouse, a dark, musty space filled with debris and standing water. They searched for disturbed earth, for signs of digging, for anything might indicate a body had been buried there. They found nothing. The farmhouse remained a mystery within a mystery, a location that seemed significant but refused to yield its secrets. In the summer of 2004, several months after Brianna's disappearance, new witnesses came forward with information that reignited the investigation. The first was a man who'd been traveling through Vermont on the night of March 19th. He'd been driving along Route 118, heading toward the Canadian border for a fishing trip. Somewhere around midnight, he'd passed the area where Brianna's car was later found. He told investigators that he'd seen something unusual. Two vehicles parked near the old farmhouse. One was a small sedan, possibly green, though he couldn't be certain of the color in the darkness. The other was a larger vehicle, either a truck or an SUV, dark-colored. There were people near the vehicles, he said. At least two, maybe three. They appeared to be doing something with the sedan, though he couldn't see what. He'd only caught a glimpse as he drove past, and at the time he hadn't thought much of it. But when he learned about Brianna's disappearance, he realized what he'd seen might be important. Detectives interviewed him extensively. Could he describe the people he'd seen? No, it had been too dark and he'd been driving at highway speed. Could he describe the vehicles in more detail? The sedan had been light-colored, he thought. The larger vehicle had been dark, maybe black or dark blue. Could he identify the make or model of either vehicle? The witness's account corroborated what the woman who lived near the farmhouse had reported, that there had been activity at the location in the hours after Brianna left work. But it still didn't provide enough detail to identify who had been there. The second witness was a teenage girl who'd been at a party in Montgomery on the night Brianna disappeared. She came forward reluctantly, afraid of getting in trouble for underage drinking, but her conscience had been bothering her for months. At the party, she'd overheard a conversation between two older guys, men in their 20s whom she didn't know well. They'd been talking in hushed voices, but she'd caught snippets of what they were saying. One of them had mentioned the girl and the car. The other had said something about making sure she couldn't talk. At the time, the teenage girl had assumed they were talking about some drama involving someone from school. She hadn't paid much attention, but after Brianna disappeared, she'd wondered if what she'd overheard might have been related. Detectives took her statement seriously. Could she identify the two men? She thought one of them might have been Raymond Ryans, though she wasn't completely sure. She didn't know the other man's name. What else had they said? She couldn't remember. The music at the party had been loud, and she'd only heard fragments of the conversation. The detectives pressed her. Was she absolutely certain she'd heard the phrase, making sure she couldn't talk? The girl hesitated. She'd heard something like that, she thought, but she couldn't swear to it. It had been months ago, and her memory was fuzzy. The testimony was frustrating. It hinted at something significant, but it was too vague to be actionable. The detectives couldn't use it to obtain a search warrant or make an arrest, but they filed it away, adding it to the growing collection of circumstantial evidence pointing toward Ryans and Jackson. While investigators pursued leads, Brianna's family was living through a hell that most people couldn't imagine. Every day brought a fresh wave of hope and despair. Every time the phone rang, Kelly Maitland's heart would leap, wondering if it was the call she'd been waiting for, news that Brianna had been found, that she was safe, that she was coming home. But the call never came. Instead, there were false sightings. People who claimed to have seen Brianna in other states and other countries. Some of these reports were made in good faith, genuine cases of mistaken identity. Others were cruel hoaxes. People seeking attention or trying to scam the Maitland family out of the reward money they'd offered. Each false lead had to be investigated. Each one had to be followed up on, verified, and ultimately dismissed. And each time the disappointment cut deeper. Bruce Maitland threw himself into the search. He drove the back roads of Vermont, looking for any sign of his daughter. He talked to anyone who would listen, showing Brianna's picture, asking if they'd seen her. He attended support groups for families of missing persons, finding some small comfort in the company of others who understood his pain. But the not knowing was the worst part. The endless questions with no answers. Was Brianna alive? Was she suffering? Was she being held somewhere, waiting for rescue? Or had she died that night, her life cut short by violence, her body hidden in some remote location where it might never be found? The uncertainty was a special kind of torture, one that wore away at the family's strength day by day. Kelly Maitland struggled with guilt, even though she had nothing to feel guilty about. She replayed every conversation she'd had with Brianna in the weeks before she disappeared, searching for clues she might have missed, warning signs she should have noticed. Brianna had mentioned the incident at her apartment, the drug-related break-in. Should Kelly have taken that more seriously? Should she have insisted Brianna move back home, where she'd be safe? Brianna had seemed distracted, a little on edge. Should Kelly have pressed her harder to talk about what was bothering her? The rational part of Kelly's mind knew that she couldn't have predicted what would happen, that she'd been a good mother who'd done everything she could to support her daughter. But the irrational part, the part consumed by grief and fear, whispered that she should have done more. Brianna's brother struggled in his own way. He'd lost not just a sister but a friend. He missed her laugh, her sarcasm, her stubborn independence. He missed having her around. At first he'd been angry at whoever had taken Brianna, angry at the police for not finding her, angry at the world for being so cruel and unfair. But as time passed, the anger gave way to sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that never fully went away. The family marked Brianna's 18th birthday without her. They marked the holidays without her. They marked the anniversary of her disappearance without her. Each milestone was a reminder of her absence, a wound that refused to heal. As the months wore on, Brianna's case was featured on several high-profile television programs. In 2006, her story was covered on Disappeared, a documentary series that examined unsolved missing person cases. The episode featured interviews with Brianna's family, friends, and the investigators working her case. It laid out the known facts, explored the various theories, and appealed viewers for information. The episode generated a surge of new tips. The police hotline was flooded with calls. Most of the tips led nowhere, but a few provided new avenues for investigation. One caller claimed to have information about a burial site in the woods near Montgomery. Investigators organized a search, bringing in ground, penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They spent days combing through the area. They found nothing. Another caller insisted that Brianna was alive and being held captive in a house in Canada. The tip was passed along to Canadian authorities. Again, nothing. The frustration was immense. Every false lead wasted time and resources. Every dead end left the investigators feeling like they were running in circles. But they couldn't give up. Brianna deserved better than that. Her family deserved better than that. In 2007, the Vermont State Police held a press conference announcing that they were treating Brianna's disappearance as a criminal homicide investigation. They didn't have a body. They didn't have definitive proof that Brianna was dead. But based on the length of time she'd been missing, the circumstances of her disappearance, and the lack of any contact with her family, they believed she'd been the victim of foul play. The announcement was difficult for Brianna's family to hear. As long as the case had been treated as a missing person investigation, there had been a sliver of hope that Brianna might still be alive. But the shift to a homicide investigation felt like an acknowledgement of the worst-case scenario. Kelly Maitland broke down during the press conference. Bruce stood beside her, his face a mask of stoic grief, and addressed the cameras. "Someone out there knows what happened to our daughter," he said, his voice firm despite the emotion beneath it. "Someone knows where she is. And we're begging you to come forward. It's been 3 years. 3 years of not knowing. Please, help us bring Brianna home." The press conference generated more media coverage, more tips, more leaps, more answers. By 2008, the investigation into Brianna's disappearance had reached a frustrating plateau. Detectives had interviewed hundreds of people. They'd searched dozens of locations. They'd pursued every credible lead and more than a few that weren't credible. They'd built circumstantial cases against multiple suspects, most notably Ramon Rines and Nathaniel Jackson. But they didn't have the one thing they needed to move forward: hard evidence. No body, no murder weapon, no confession, no physical proof that definitively connected any suspect to Brianna's disappearance. The case remained open, but the active investigation had slowed. Detectives still followed up on tips as they came in, but the daily intensive work had given way to periodic reviews of the evidence, hoping something new would emerge. It was a bitter pill to swallow for everyone involved. The investigators had worked tirelessly on the case. They'd dedicated years of their careers to finding answers. They'd lost sleep, strained their personal relationships, and carried the weight of the Maitland family's grief. But despite all their efforts, they'd come up short. Brianna's family continued to push for answers. They kept her case in the public eye as much as possible. They updated her missing person posters with age-progressed images, showing what Brianna might look like as she grew older. They never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would learn what happened to their daughter on that cold March night in 2004. As the years passed and technology advanced, the Vermont State Police made the decision to re-examine the evidence from Brianna's case using newer forensic techniques that hadn't been available in 2004. In 2012, 8 years after Brianna's disappearance, investigators partnered with the FBI to conduct a comprehensive review of all physical evidence. This included retesting DNA samples, reanalyzing fingerprints with enhanced databases and employing advanced digital forensics to examine any electronic evidence that had been collected. The rear examination began with Brianna's car, the green Oldsmobile that had been found at the abandoned farmhouse. The vehicle had been stored in a police evidence facility, preserved exactly as it had been found. Now, forensic technicians went over it again, inch by inch, using methods that were far more sophisticated than those available in 2004. They used alternate light sources to search for biological fluids that might have been missed during the initial investigation. They employed new chemical reagents that could detect trace amounts of blood or other substances. They examined the car's interior with microscopic precision, looking for fibers, hairs, skin cells, anything that might provide a DNA profile. The results were both promising and frustrating. The technicians found several additional biological samples that hadn't been detected in 2004. Tiny traces of blood on the driver's side door handle, a few skin cells on the steering wheel, strands of hair that had been trapped in the seat fabric. These samples were sent to the FBI laboratory for DNA analysis. The process took months as the samples were extremely small and degraded from years of storage. But eventually results came back. Most of the DNA profiles matched Brianna or people who were known to have been in her car, legitimately friends, family members, co-workers who had accepted rides from her. But there were two profiles that couldn't be identified. Two sets of DNA that belonged to unknown individuals who had at some point been inside Brianna's car. Could these profiles belong to whoever was responsible for Brianna's disappearance? It was impossible to say with certainty. The DNA could have been transferred innocuously from customers at the Black Lantern Inn who'd brushed against Brianna's uniform before she got in her car, or from people who'd simply touched her vehicle while it was parked. But it was also possible that the DNA belonged to someone who'd been in the car with Brianna on the night she disappeared, someone who'd driven the vehicle to the farmhouse, someone who knew what had happened to her. Investigators entered the unknown DNA profiles into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which maintains a database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence from unsolved crimes across the country. They waited for a match. Weeks passed, then months. The database contained millions of profiles, but none matched the unknown DNA from Brianna's car. It was another dead end, but the profiles remained in the system. If anyone matching those DNA signatures was ever arrested and had their DNA collected, the system would flag the match automatically. It was a long shot, but it was something. The re-examination also focused on the fingerprints that had been found in Brianna's car. In 2004, the prints had been compared against Vermont's fingerprint database and the FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system, but no matches had been found for several of the unidentified prints. By 2012, IAFIS had been upgraded to the next-generation identification system, which had significantly better resolution and a much larger database. The unidentified prints from Brianna's car were resubmitted to the new system. This time, there was a partial match on one of the prints. The print belonged to a man named Derek, a local resident with a lengthy criminal record that included burglary, assault, and drug-related offenses. Derek had been arrested multiple times over the years, and his fingerprints had been entered into the system. Detectives were cautiously excited. Finally, a tangible lead, a name they could pursue. They brought Derek in for questioning. Derek was in his 30s now, weathered by years of substance abuse and run-ins with the law. He sat across from the detectives, his expression wary, his body language defensive. "We found your fingerprint in Brianna Maitland's car," the detective said, watching Derek's reaction carefully. "Can you explain how it got there?" Derek's eyes darted around the room. He shifted in his seat. "I don't know any Brianna Maitland," he said. "You sure about that? 'Cause your print's in her vehicle." Derek thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe I touched her car at some point. I don't know. I touch a lot of cars. This wasn't just touching the outside of the car. Your print was found on the interior door panel." Derek's expression changed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face.
"What?"
he said. "What year did this girl go missing?" 2004. Derek relaxed visibly. "Oh hell. I know how my print got there. I used to work at a garage back then." We did some repairs on an old Oldsmobile around that time. That must have been her car. The detectives exchanged glances. This was verifiable. They asked Derek which garage he'd worked at, and he gave them the name. Follow-up investigation confirmed Derek's story. The garage's records, though incomplete, showed that a green 1985 Oldsmobile sedan had been brought in for repairs in early 2004, a few weeks before Brianna disappeared. Derek had been working there at the time, and had likely handled the vehicle during the repair process. It was a plausible, innocent explanation for how his fingerprint ended up in Brianna's car. The detectives couldn't completely rule Derek out as a suspect, but without any other evidence connecting him to the case, they had no grounds to pursue him further. Another promising lead had fizzled out. Throughout the years, Raymond Ryans and Nathaniel Jackson remained the primary persons of interest in Brianna's disappearance. Despite the lack of physical evidence directly linking them to the case, the circumstantial evidence was substantial enough that investigators never fully moved on from them. Both men had continued their involvement in criminal activities in the years since Brianna vanished. Ryans had been arrested multiple times for drug trafficking, assault, and weapons charges. He'd served time in prison, been released, and cycled back into the same destructive patterns. Jackson had followed a similar trajectory, in and out of jail, his life a revolving door of crime, incarceration and brief periods of freedom. In 2014, a significant development occurred. Raymond Ryans was arrested on federal drug trafficking charges. The case against him was solid, built on months of surveillance, wiretapped conversations, and testimony from informants. Ryans was looking at a lengthy prison sentence, potentially decades behind bars. Investigators working Brianna's case saw an opportunity. They approached federal prosecutors with a proposal to offer Ryans a reduced sentence in exchange for information about Brianna Maitland. The prosecutors agreed it was worth a shot. Ryans was brought into an interrogation room. His attorney was present. The lead detective on Brianna's case sat across from him and laid out the offer. "We know you know something about what happened to Brianna," the detective said. "You've been a suspect from the beginning. We've never been able to prove it, but we know. And here's your chance to do the right thing. Tell us what happened. Tell us where she is. Help her family finally get some closure. And in exchange, we'll work with the prosecutors to reduce your sentence." Ryans listened, his expression unreadable. When the detective finished, Ryans leaned back in his chair and smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "I don't know anything about that girl," he said. "I told you that years ago. Nothing's changed. Ramon, this is your last chance. You're going away for a long time. You'll be an old man when you get out if you ever do. Why protect whoever did this? Why carry that weight?" Ryan shook his head. "I got nothing to say." The detective tried different approaches, appealing to Ryan's sense of decency, suggesting that helping Brianna's family was the one good thing he could do with his life, reminding him that eventually someone would talk and he'd lose his chance for a deal. Nothing worked. Ryans maintained his position. He claimed he knew nothing about Brianna's disappearance and refused to provide any information. The interrogation ended. Ryans was convicted on the federal drug charges and sentenced to 23 years in prison. Investigators were left to wonder, was Ryans truly innocent? Or was he simply unwilling to admit to a crime that could add murder charges to his already lengthy sentence? Nathaniel Jackson was approached with a similar offer a year later when he was arrested on state drug charges. The result was the same. Jackson denied any knowledge of what had happened to Brianna and refused to cooperate. The investigators were convinced that one or both of these men knew something. The timing, the connections, the suspicious behavior in the aftermath of Brianna's disappearance, all of it pointed in their direction. But without a confession, without physical evidence, without a body, there was nothing the police could do. As Brianna's case lingered unsolved, various theories emerged from unexpected sources. Some came from armchair detectives on internet forums dedicated to true crime. Others came from people who claimed to have insider knowledge, individuals who reached out to Brianna's family, or to the police with stories that were sometimes intriguing, sometimes bizarre, and always difficult to verify. One persistent theory involved a serial killer. In 2004, the same year Brianna disappeared, There had been other unsolved disappearances and murders of young women in the northeastern United States. Some true crime researchers began to wonder if these cases might be connected. The work of a single predator who traveled between states, targeting vulnerable young women. The theory gained some traction online. Researchers compiled lists of similar cases, mapping out locations and timelines looking for patterns. But law enforcement was skeptical. The cases, while superficially similar, had significant differences. Different victim profiles, different circumstances, different methods. There was no solid evidence linking them, no common DNA, no witness descriptions that matched across multiple cases. Still, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the cases, including Brianna's, to see if there were any connections worth pursuing. Their conclusion was that while it was theoretically possible that some of the cases were related, there wasn't enough evidence to support the serial killer theory, in Brianna's case specifically. Another theory that emerged was more localized and more disturbing. In 2016, a woman came forward claiming to have information about a death cult operating in northern Vermont in the early 2000s. According to this woman, the group was involved in drug trafficking, occult practices, and occasional acts of violence against people they perceived as threats or enemies. The woman claimed that Brianna had somehow crossed paths with members of this group and had been killed as part of a ritualistic act. She provided some names, most of which were people already known to law enforcement as being involved in drug-related crimes. Investigators took the information seriously, at least initially. They interviewed the woman extensively, trying to determine if her claims had any basis in reality, or if she was suffering from delusions or seeking attention. The more they dug, the less credible the story seemed. The woman had a history of mental health issues and had made similar claims about other crimes in the past, none of which had ever been substantiated. She couldn't provide any verifiable details about the supposed cult or its activities. She couldn't explain how she'd acquired her information. Eventually, the investigators concluded that the woman's story was a fabrication, possibly the product of paranoid delusions mixed with information she'd gleaned from news coverage of various crimes. The death cult theory was discarded. Yet another theory centered on the possibility that Brianna had been killed by accident, and that her body had been disposed of in a moment of panic. According to this scenario, Brianna had met up with someone she knew on the night she disappeared, perhaps one of the people she'd mentioned to her co-workers. An argument had ensued, possibly related to drugs or money. A push, a shove, a blow to the head. Brianna had fallen, hit her head at something, and died instantly. The person responsible, terrified of being charged with murder, had panicked. They'd put Brianna's body in their vehicle, driven her car to the farmhouse to make it look like she'd run away or been abducted, and then disposed of her body somewhere remote. This theory had the advantage of fitting the known facts reasonably well. It explained the car at the farmhouse. It explained why there was no sign of premeditated murder. It explained why someone might refuse to confess even when offered a deal. Admitting to an accidental killing would still result in serious criminal charges. But like all the other theories, it couldn't be proven. Without a body, without witnesses, without a confession, it remained pure speculation. Despite the lack of official breakthroughs, Brianna's family never stopped searching. In 2015, Bruce Maitland organized a large-scale volunteer search of areas around Montgomery that hadn't been thoroughly examined in the initial investigation. Dozens of volunteers showed up, people from the community who remembered Brianna, who'd followed her case over the years, who wanted to help in any way they could. They spread out across the landscape, walking through dense woods, checking ravines and gullies, searching along the banks of streams and rivers. They looked in abandoned buildings, under bridges, and any place where a body might have been concealed. The search lasted 3 days. In the end, they found nothing related to Brianna, but Bruce wasn't discouraged. "We'll keep looking," he told reporters. "We'll never stop looking." Kelly Maitland focused her energy on keeping Brianna's case in the public consciousness. She maintained a Facebook page dedicated to Brianna, posting updates, sharing memories, appealing for information. The page gained thousands of followers, people from around the world who'd heard Brianna's story, and felt Kempemli's quest for answers. Kelly also worked with advocacy groups for families of missing persons, speaking at conferences and events, sharing her experience and offering support to others going through similar ordeals. In many ways, keeping Brianna's memory alive became Kelly's life's work. It was the only thing that made the pain bearable. The knowledge that she was doing everything possible to find her daughter. By the late 2010s, advances in forensic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations. The technique, which involves using DNA from crime scenes to build genetic family trees through public genealogy databases, had led to the identification of suspects in decades-old cases, including the capture of the infamous Golden State Killer. Brianna's family and the Vermont State Police began exploring whether this technology could be applied to her case. The unknown DNA profiles from Brianna's car were submitted to a specialized laboratory that worked with forensic genealogy. Genealogists created profiles and uploaded them to public databases like GeneMatch, searching for genetic matches that might to the identification of the individuals who left the DNA. The process was painstaking. Genetic genealogy requires not just finding matches, but building detailed family trees, sometimes going back several generations, to narrow down potential suspects. And the quality of the DNA samples from Brianna's car was marginal at best, which made the process even more challenging. After months of work, the genealogists managed to build partial family trees for the two unknown DNA profiles. They identified several possible relatives of the individuals who'd left the DNA. Investigators began the delicate process of contacting these relatives, explaining the situation, and trying to determine which specific family member might have been in Brianna's car. It was slow, difficult work. Many of the relatives were reluctant to cooperate, uncomfortable with the idea that someone in their family might be connected to a missing person case. Some refused to speak with investigators at all. But gradually, detectives narrowed down the possibilities. One of the DNA profiles was eventually linked to a man who'd lived in Vermont in the early 2000s, but had since moved out of state. Investigators tracked him down and interviewed him. He confirmed that he'd known Brianna casually, that he'd accepted a ride from her once, several weeks before she disappeared. That was how his DNA ended up in her car. The detectives verified his alibi for the night Brianna vanished. He'd been working a night shift at a manufacturing plant over an hour away from Montgomery. Time cards and witness statements confirmed he couldn't have been involved. Another lead, another dead end. The second DA profile proved even more difficult to trace. The family tree was incomplete, with several branches that couldn't be fully resolved. The investigators were still working on it, but progress was frustratingly slow. As the years stretched into more than a decade, the emotional toll on Brianna's family became increasingly visible. Bruce Maitland aged dramatically. The vibrant, energetic man he'd once been was replaced by someone who carried the weight of profound grief in every movement, every expression. He still searched for Brianna, still followed up on leads, still refused to give up hope. But those who knew him could see that the endless uncertainty was slowly breaking him. In interviews, Bruce spoke about the peculiar torture of not knowing. If Brianna had died in a car accident, he said once, would be horrible. We'd grieve, we'd mourn, but we'd have closure. We'd be able to bury our daughter, to say goodbye. But this, not knowing if she's alive or dead, not knowing if she suffered, not knowing where she is, it's a special kind of hell. Kelly Maitland channeled her grief into activism, but it took its toll on her as well. She suffered from anxiety and depression, struggled with insomnia, found herself replaying the last conversation she'd had with Brianna over and over, searching for meaning in every word. She took medication. She leaned on support groups and friends. But nothing could truly fill the void left by Brianna's absence. Brianna's brother, now an adult with a life of his own, struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had Brianna been taken while he'd been safe? It was an irrational feeling he knew, but he couldn't shake it. He thought about her constantly, wondered what she'd be like now if she were still alive, what kind of relationship they'd have as adults. He got married. He had children of his own. But there was always an empty chair at every family gathering, a missing presence that should have been there. The family marked anniversaries in their own way. Every March 19th, the anniversary of Brianna's disappearance, they held a small vigil. Sometimes it was just the immediate family. Sometimes friends and community members joined them. They lit candles, shared memories, and renewed their commitment to finding answers. "We owe it to Brianna," Kelly would say. "We owe it to her to never stop looking, to never let her be forgotten." Over the years, Brianna's case was covered in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and articles. Each new piece of media coverage brought a fresh wave of attention, new tips to the police hotline, new theories proposed by amateur sleuths. Some of the coverage was respectful and well-researched, presenting Brianna's story with the seriousness and sensitivity it deserved. These productions often featured interviews with her family, law enforcement officials, and people who'd known Brianna, providing a comprehensive look at the case. But other coverage was sensationalized, more interested in exploiting the mystery for entertainment value than in genuinely trying to help solve the case. These productions sometimes spread misinformation, presented unverified theories as fact, or focused on salacious details while ignoring the human tragedy at the heart of the story. Brianna's family had mixed feelings about the media attention. On one hand, they appreciated anything that kept Brianna's case in the public eye, that might prompt someone with information to finally come forward. On the other hand, they were frustrated by the inaccuracies and speculation that often accompanied the coverage. Kelly Maitland became selective about which media requests she accepted. She agreed to participate in productions that she felt would honor Brianna's memory and genuinely contribute to the search for answers. She declined requests from outlets that seemed more interested in sensationalism than truth. One of the most impactful pieces of coverage came in 2018, when a popular true crime podcast dedicated a multi-episode series to Brianna's case. The podcast host had done extensive research, interviewed dozens of people, and presented a nuanced, thoughtful exploration of the evidence and theories. The podcast episodes were downloaded millions of times. They sparked widespread discussion on social media, generated hundreds of new tips to the Vermont State Police, and brought Brianna's case to the attention of people who'd never heard of it before. Among the new tips was one that seemed particularly promising. A listener in Canada contacted the police claiming to have information about a woman matching Brianna's description, who'd been seen in a small town in the years after her disappearance. Investigators followed up on the tip, contacting Canadian authorities and traveling to the town in question. They interviewed people, showed them Brianna's photo, searched for any evidence that she might have been there. But once again, the lead went nowhere. The woman the tipster had seen turned out to be a Canadian citizen, with no connection to Brianna whatsoever. It had simply been a case of someone who bore a passing resemblance. As the 20th anniversary of Brianna's disappearance approached, her family faced a difficult question. How long could they continue to hope? It was a question that had no good answer. Hope was what had sustained them through 2 decades of uncertainty. Hope that Brianna might still be alive somewhere. Hope that she might come home. Hope that, at the very least, they might learn what had happened to her and be able to lay her to rest with dignity. But hope was also a burden. It kept them in a state of perpetual waiting, unable to fully grieve, unable to move forward with their lives in any meaningful way. Some well-meaning friends and family members suggested that it might be time to accept that Brianna was gone, to hold a memorial service, to find some measure of closure even without definitive answers. But Bruce and Kelly Maitland couldn't bring themselves to do it. To hold a memorial service felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. As long as there was even the slimmest possibility that Brianna might be alive, they couldn't let go. "I'll search for her until the day I die," Bruce said in a 2023 interview. "And if I die before we find her, I hope someone else will keep searching. Brianna deserves that. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice." Kelly echoed her husband's sentiments. "We've lived with this for 20 years, she said. 20 years of not knowing. 20 years of pain. But we can't stop. Someone out there knows what happened to our daughter, and we're going to keep fighting until that person tells the truth." In 2022, 18 years after Brianna's disappearance, the Vermont State Police made a significant announcement that reignited public interest in the case. They revealed that they were actively pursuing new leads based on information that had come to light within the past year. While they couldn't disclose the specific nature of these leads, due to the ongoing investigation, they emphasized that the case remained a top priority, and that they believed they were closer than ever to finding answers. The announcement came during a press conference held on the anniversary of Brianna's disappearance. Detective Sergeant Angela Baker, who had taken over as the lead investigator on the case several years earlier, stood before a room full of reporters and cameras. "Brianna Maitland's case has never been forgotten," she said, her voice firm and determined. "We have dedicated investigators who continue to work on this case regularly. We have new forensic tools that didn't exist when Brianna first disappeared. And we have received new information that we believe is credible and significant." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To anyone out there who knows what happened to Brianna, the time to come forward is now. Technology has advanced, DNA databases have expanded, forensic techniques have improved dramatically. If you were involved in Brianna's disappearance, or if you know who was involved, understand that we will find the truth eventually. It's only a matter of time." The press conference generated considerable media coverage. News outlets across New England picked up the story. Social media buzzed with speculation about what the new leads might be. Brianna's family, who attended the press conference, allowed themselves a cautious sense of optimism. After so many years of disappointment, they were wary of getting their hopes up too high. But the fact that investigators felt confident enough to make such a public statement suggested that something substantial had developed. In the weeks following the press conference, the police tip line received a surge of new calls. Some were from people who'd been reluctant to come forward in the past, but were now emboldened by the renewed focus on the case. Others were from individuals who'd heard the press conference and suddenly remembered details they'd previously dismissed as unimportant. One tip in particular proved to be extremely valuable. A woman contacted the Vermont State Police claiming to have information about a conversation she'd overheard in 2004, shortly after Brianna disappeared. At the time, the woman had been in her early 20s, living in a difficult situation with an abusive boyfriend who was involved in the drug trade. One night, the boyfriend had come home late, agitated and paranoid. He'd been drinking, and in his intoxicated state, he'd started talking about the Maitland girl with another man who'd been at their apartment. The woman, who'd been in another room but could hear the conversation, heard fragments of what was said. She heard her boyfriend say something about getting rid of her and making sure she wouldn't talk. She heard the other man respond, saying they needed to keep their mouths shut and that nobody would find her. At the time, the woman had been terrified. Her boyfriend was violent, unpredictable, and had made it clear that if she ever went to the police about anything he was involved in, she'd face severe consequences. So she'd said nothing, had tried to forget what she'd heard, had told herself it was probably just drunk talk, men trying to sound tough. But over the years, the guilt had eaten away at her. She'd eventually left the abusive relationship, had rebuilt her life, had gotten therapy and worked on healing from the trauma she'd experienced. And as she'd become stronger, the memory of that overheard conversation had haunted her more and more. When she heard about the 2022 press conference, she made a decision. She was going to tell the truth, regardless of the potential consequences. Detectives interviewed her extensively over the course of several sessions. They asked her to describe the conversation in as much detail as she could remember. They asked about her boyfriend at the time, about the other man who'd been present, about anything else she might have seen or heard. The woman provided names. Her ex-boyfriend was a man named Thomas, who'd been part of the same drug network as Raymond Ryans and Nathaniel Jackson. The other man present during the conversation had been Jackson himself. This was the connection investigators had been looking for, a direct link between Jackson and statements about Brianna being killed. Thomas was located and brought in for questioning. He was now in his 40s, had served time for various drug offenses over the years, and was currently out on parole. When confronted with his ex-girlfriend's testimony, Thomas initially denied everything. He claimed he didn't remember the conversation, that he'd been so messed up on drugs back that he couldn't possibly recall what he'd said on any given night. But the detectives pressed him. They told him that they had multiple pieces of evidence pointing to his involvement, that they knew he'd been present when something happened to Brianna, that his best option was to cooperate now before they built a case that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. Thomas asked for an attorney. The interview ended, but something had shifted. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, investigators felt like they were finally getting close to the truth. With new testimony pointing directly at Nathaniel Jackson and his associate Thomas, the Vermont State Police intensified their focus on both men. Jackson was currently incarcerated on unrelated charges. He'd been in and out of prison for years, and at this point, he was serving a sentence for aggravated assault and drug trafficking. He wasn't eligible for parole for at least another 5 years. Detectives arranged to interview him at the correctional facility where he was being held. Jackson, now in his early 40s, had aged poorly. Years of substance abuse, violence, and incarceration had taken their toll. He looked older than his actual age, his face lined and hardened. When the detective sat down across from him, Jackson's demeanor was familiar, defensive, hostile, uncooperative. He'd been through this routine before multiple times over the years, and he knew how to handle interrogations. "We have new evidence," Detective Sergeant Baker told him. "Evidence that directly implicates you in Brianna Maitland's disappearance." Jackson shrugged. "You've been saying that for 20 years. You got nothing. We have a witness who heard you and Thomas discussing what you did to Brianna. We have that witness on record, willing to testify." For the first time, Jackson's composure cracked slightly. His eyes narrowed. "Oh, we can't tell you that, but the witness is credible, and their testimony is consistent with other evidence we've gathered over the years." Jackson leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. "I want my lawyer. Nathaniel, you're already in prison. You're going to be here for years. But if you had anything to do with Brianna's death, you're looking at additional charges, murder charges. You could be looking at life without parole." I said, "I want my lawyer." The detectives tried a different approach. "Help us understand what happened. If it was an accident, if things got out of hand and you didn't mean for her to die, that matters. That's the difference between second-degree murder and first-degree. That's the difference between having a chance at parole someday and dying in prison." Jackson stared at them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something. His lips parted slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him tensed. But then he shook his head. "Lawyer now." The interview ended. Jackson was escorted back to his cell. The detectives left the facility frustrated but not discouraged. They'd seen Jackson's reaction when they mentioned the witness. He'd been rattled, even if only for a moment. They were getting to him, and eventually they believed he would break. Thomas proved to be a more vulnerable target. Unlike Jackson, who'd spent so much of his life in the criminal justice system that he'd become hardened to pressure, Thomas still had something to lose. He was on parole, trying to rebuild his life. He had family members who still spoke to him, a few people who believed he could turn things around. Detectives approached him again, this time with his parole officer present. They laid out the situation clearly. They had testimony placing him in a conversation about Brianna's murder. They had evidence linking him to the people suspected of being involved, and they had the ability to bring charges that would send him back to prison for a very long time. But they also offered him a way out. "Tell us the truth," Detective Baker said. "Tell us what happened to Brianna. If you weren't directly involved, if you were just there, if you just helped cover being the one who killed her. Work with us. Give us the full story, and we'll talk to the prosecutor about a deal." Thomas sat in silence for a long time, his face a mask of internal conflict. His attorney whispered something to him, but Thomas didn't seem to hear. Finally he spoke. "If I talk, I'm dead. You understand that. These people don't forget, they don't forgive. You're more afraid of them than you are of spending the rest of your life in prison. You don't know what they're capable of. Then tell us. Help us put them away so they can't hurt anyone else." Thomas shook his head, but there was less conviction in the gesture than before. He was wavering. "The detectives could see it. I need to think," he said finally. "I need time to think." The detectives agreed to give him a few days. They left him with contact information, told him the offer wouldn't be on the table forever, and encouraged him to do the right thing. As they walked out of the building, Detective Baker turned to her partner. "He's going to talk," she said. "Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but he's going to talk." Based on the new testimony, along with all the evidence that had been gathered over the years, investigators began to construct what they believed was the most accurate theory of what had happened to Brianna Maitland on the March 19, 2004. According to this theory, Brianna had left the Black Lantern Inn after her shift around 11:20 p.m., just as everyone had confirmed. But instead of driving straight home, she'd gone to meet someone. Either she'd planned the meeting in advance, or she'd been contacted shortly after leaving work and agreed to meet up. The meeting was likely related to the drug scene she'd become peripherally involved with through her connections to various people in the area. Perhaps she'd been asked to deliver something, or to pick something up. Perhaps she'd been invited to hang out, to party, to relax after a long shift. Whatever the reason, Brianna had driven to a location where Raymond Ryans, Nathaniel Jackson Thomas, and possibly others were present. This might have been the farmhouse where Ryans and Jackson were staying, or it might have been another location entirely. At some point during this meeting, something went wrong. There might have been an argument. Brianna might have said something that angered the men present. She might have witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. She might have threatened to go to the police about something. Or it might have been something more sinister. One of the men might have made unwanted advances toward Brianna. She might have rejected those advances and things might have escalated. Whatever the trigger, violence erupted. Brianna was struck either with a fist or with an object. She fell. She hit her head. And she died, either instantly or shortly after. The men present panicked. They now had a dead teenage girl on their hands, and they knew they'd face murder charges if anyone found out. So they made a decision. They would dispose of Brianna's body and stage her car to make it look like she'd run away or been abducted by someone else. They put Brianna's body in one of their vehicles, likely a truck, and drove it to a remote location where it would be unlikely to ever be found. Meanwhile, one of them drove Brianna's car to the abandoned farmhouse on Route 118 and backed it deliberately into the building, creating the strange scene that would confuse investigators for years to come. The positioning of the car against the farmhouse might have been intended to make it look like Brianna had crashed while under the influence, or it might have been a deliberate attempt to create a puzzle that would send investigators in the wrong direction. After staging the car, the person who'd driven it there was picked up by the others, and they all left the scene. In the hours and days that followed, the men involved maintained their silence. They created alibis, corroborated each other's stories, and refused to crack under police pressure. Over the years, as the investigation intensified, the burden of the secret weighed on them. Some became paranoid, others self-destructive. But their fear of the consequences, both legal and from within their criminal circles, kept them quiet. Until now, when under nearly 2 decades, the walls were beginning to crumble. No Ars Briannan. The question that haunted everyone connected to the case was simple but agonizing: where is Brianna's body? If the theory investigators had constructed was correct, then Brianna had been taken somewhere after she was killed and buried, or concealed in a location where she wouldn't be found. But where? Vermont is a heavily forested state with vast expanses of wilderness. There are thousands of acres of dense woods, countless remote locations where a body could be hidden and might never be discovered. There are abandoned mines, deep ravines, isolated ponds, and areas so far off the beaten path that people rarely, if ever, venture there. The men responsible for Brianna's disappearance would have known the area well. They'd grown up in northern Vermont, had spent their lives navigating its back roads and hidden corners. They would have known exactly where to go to ensure that Brianna would never be found. Over the years, investigators had dozens of locations based on tips, theories, and educated guesses. They'd used ground-penetrating radar, brought in cadaver dogs, employed drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras. They'd searched forests, checked old wells, excavated suspicious areas. But Vermont is simply too large, the wilderness too vast, for a comprehensive search to be feasible. The only realistic way to find Brianna's remains was for someone who knew where she was buried to come forward and tell the truth. That's what investigators were hoping Thomas, or possibly even Jackson, do. Detective Baker made it clear in public statements. We believe we know who is responsible for Brianna's death, but we need to locate her remains. We need to bring her home to her family. If anyone with knowledge of where Brianna is buried comes forward, we will take that into serious consideration when determining charges and recommending sentences. It was a direct appeal to the conscience of everyone involved, a final chance to do the right thing. By 2023, Bruce and Kelly Maitland were in their 60s. Nearly 2 decades had passed since Brianna had vanished from their lives, and the toll was visible in every aspect of their existence. Kelly had become a prominent advocate for missing person cases. She worked with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and helped other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. It gave her purpose, a way to channel her pain into something constructive. But it didn't make the pain go away. People ask me how I cope, Kelly said in a 1023 interview. And the truth is, I don't, not really. You don't cope with something like this. You survive it day by day, moment by moment. Some days are better than others. Some days I can function almost normally, other days, I can barely get out of bed. She paused, her eyes distant. But I keep going because Brianna needs me to. She needs someone to fight for her, to make sure she's not forgotten. And I'll keep fighting until I have no fight left in me. Bruce had become more reclusive over the years. He'd retired from his job, unable to maintain the focus and energy required. He spent most of his time at home, surrounded by reminders of Brianna, her photos, her belongings, the memories of who she'd been. He still went out periodically to search areas where he thought Brianna might be buried. Sometimes he went alone, driving the back roads of Vermont with a shovel in his trunk, ready to investigate any location that seemed suspicious. Other times he organized small groups of volunteers to help him search. It was in some ways an exercise in futility. The odds of randomly stumbling across Brianna's remains were infinitesimally small. But Bruce needed to feel like he was doing something, anything, to find his daughter. I can't just sit around and wait, he told a reporter. I can't put my faith entirely in the system and the police investigation. Don't get me wrong, they're doing their job. But this is my daughter, my baby, and I have to do everything I can to bring her home. Brianna's brother, now in his late 30s, had found his own way to cope with the loss. He'd named his daughter after Brianna, ensuring that her name would live on in the next generation. He told his children about their aunt, about who she'd been, what she'd dreamed of, how much she'd loved life. My kids will never meet Brianna, he said. But they'll know her. They'll know her story. And maybe if we're lucky, they'll get to see her buried properly someday. Maybe they'll get to visit her grave, to leave flowers, to say goodbye. That's all I want now. Just closure. Just the ability to say goodbye. Brianna's disappearance had left an indelible mark on the communities of Montgomery and the surrounding area. For years after she vanished, parents held their children a little closer, watched them a little more carefully. The case served as a stark reminder that terrible things could happen anywhere, even in small, supposedly safe communities. The Black Lantern Inn, where Brianna had worked her last shift, changed ownership several times in the years after her disappearance. Each new owner had to contend with the location's dark history. Some embraced it, acknowledging Brianna's connection to the place and expressing hope that the case would someday be solved. Others tried to distance themselves from it, preferring not to discuss the tragedy that had touched their business. The abandoned farmhouse where Brianna's car was found became an unofficial memorial site. People would occasionally stop by, leaving flowers, notes, or small tokens in Brianna's memory. The property owner, while understanding the impulse, eventually had to put up no trespassing signs because the foot traffic was becoming excessive. In 2014, on the 10th anniversary of Brianna's disappearance, the town of Montgomery held a public vigil. Hundreds of people attended, many of them holding candles and wearing green ribbons, Brianna's favorite color. Speakers shared memories of Brianna, spoke about the importance of never giving up hope, and called on anyone with information to finally come forward. The event was covered by local media and brought renewed attention to the case, generating another wave of tips to the police hotline. Similar vigils were held on subsequent anniversaries, though the crowds gradually grew smaller as the years passed and public attention naturally waned. But a core group of community members remained committed, showing up year after year to ensure that Brianna was not forgotten. The case had also taken a toll on the investigators who'd worked it over the years. Several detectives who'd been involved in the initial investigation had since retired, but they still thought about Brianna regularly. Some of them continued to follow the case, calling their former colleagues for updates, offering suggestions based on their years of experience. One retired detective, who'd spent 3 years working Brianna's case full-time, spoke candidly about the psychological impact. "You carry these cases with you," he said, "especially the unsolved ones. Especially when the victim is young, when they had their whole life ahead of them. You think about all the things Brianna never got to experience, graduating from school, falling in love, getting married, having kids, all the milestones that were stolen from her." He paused, emotion flickering across his face. "And you think about her family, about what they're going through. You meet with them regularly. You see their pain, and you feel this overwhelming responsibility to solve the case, to give them answers. And when you can't, when years go by and you still can't give them what they need, it weighs on you." Detective Sergeant Angela Baker, the current lead investigator, acknowledged the challenges of working such a high-profile cold case. "There's pressure," she admitted. "Pressure from the family, from the community, from the media, from yourself. Everyone wants answers. Everyone wants justice for Brianna. And you feel that weight every single day." But she also emphasized that the pressure was motivating rather than debilitating. "It keeps me focused," she said. "It reminds me why this work matters. And it drives me to keep pushing. To keep investigating, to never give up. Because Brianna deserves that, her family deserves that, and I truly believe we're going to solve this case." In the years since Brianna's disappearance, social media had transformed the way missing person cases were publicized and investigated. Brianna's case had a significant presence across multiple platforms. Facebook pages dedicated to her case had thousands of followers. True crime communities on Reddit and other forums regularly discussed the evidence, debated theories, and shared information. This online presence had both positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it kept Brianna's case in the public consciousness. It meant that new generations of people were learning about her story, people who might have information or connections that could help solve the case. It also provided a platform for crowdsourced investigation, where amateur sleuths could sometimes identify connections or patterns that professional investigators had missed. Several tips that proved valuable had come from people who'd learned about Brianna's case through social media, and then remembered something relevant from their own lives or communities. On the negative side, social media also became a breeding ground for wild speculation, conspiracy theories, and sometimes outright misinformation. People with no direct knowledge of the case would present their theories as fact, accusing specific individuals of involvement without evidence, spreading rumors that could damage reputations and complicate the official investigation. Brianna's family had to navigate this landscape carefully. They appreciated the support and attention from the online community, but they also had to regularly debunk false information and ask people not to engage in vigilante investigations or harassment of potential suspects. "We want people to care about Brianna's case," Kelly said. "We want people to share her story to keep her memory alive. But we also need people to be responsible. Don't accuse anyone without proof. Don't spread rumors. And if you have real information, take it to the police, not to social media." As we approach the 20th anniversary of Brianna Maitland's disappearance, the case remains unsolved, though investigators insist they are closer than ever to finding answers. The Vermont State Police continue to actively work the case. New forensic techniques are applied to old evidence. Witnesses are re-interviewed. Pressure is maintained on the individuals believed to be responsible. But the fundamental questions remain unanswered. What exactly happened to Brianna on the night of March 19, 2004? Who was involved? Where is her body? These questions haunt everyone who has been touched by this case. They haunt Brianna's family, who have spent nearly 2 decades trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty. They haunt the investigators who have dedicated years of their careers to finding the truth. They haunt the community that watched one of their own vanish without a trace. The most likely scenario, based on all available evidence, is that Brianna encountered people involved in the local drug trade after leaving work. An interaction that should have been brief and unremarkable turned deadly. And in the aftermath, those responsible disposed of her body and maintained a code of silence that has held for nearly 20 years. Raymond Ryans and Nathaniel Jackson remain the primary suspects, though they have never been charged. Both men continue to deny any involvement. Both refuse to cooperate with investigators, even when offered deals that could reduce their sentences on other crimes. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest walls of silence. People age, circumstances change, consciences become burdened, and eventually someone always talks. Detective Sergeant Angela Baker believes that day is coming soon. "We will solve this case," she said in her most recent public statement. "It's not a matter of if but when. The people responsible are living with this secret, and that weight never gets lighter. Eventually someone will break, and when they do, we'll be ready." For Brianna's family, the wait continues. Bruce and Kelly Maitland wake up every morning not knowing if this will be the day they finally get the call they've been waiting for. The call that will tell them where their daughter is. The call that will allow them to bring her home, to bury her with dignity, to finally say goodbye. "We've never given up," Kelly says, "and we never will." Brianna deserves justice. She deserves to be found. She deserves to rest in peace. Somewhere in the forests of Vermont, Brianna Maitland waits to be discovered. A young woman who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, who loved her family, who was just 17 years old when her life was stolen from her. Her story is not over, not yet. Because as long as there are people fighting for the truth, as long as there are investigators refusing to give up, as long as there is a family that will never stop searching, Brianna's case remains alive. And someday the truth will emerge from the darkness. Thank you for listening. If you have any information about Brianna Maitland's disappearance, please contact the Vermont State Police. Her family is still waiting, still hoping, still searching for answers. Good night and stay safe.